The savannah held its breath as darkness swallowed the land. An old lion stood alone on a ridge overlooking the African plains, his mane thin and matted, his body scarred beyond recognition. Every predator within miles knew his name. They laughed about him around their kills. They called him broken. They called him worthless, a living ghost that should have already surrendered to death. But tonight something had changed in those amber eyes, something that burned hotter than it had in years. The young males of the territory thought they had won. They thought they had finally broken the last thread of his dominance. They were about to learn what happens when you push a king into a corner with nothing left to lose. His name was Kiboro, and for 17 years he had ruled this land with an iron will that made every creature in the savannah respect his roar. But age catches everyone eventually. His joints ached. His teeth were worn down. The speed that once made him deadly had slowed to something almost ordinary. The young males had sensed the weakness before he even felt it himself. They started testing him 6 months ago. Small challenges at first. A young male would roar too close to the border. Another would mark trees in Kiboro's territory like he owned them. At first, Kiboro fought back with brutal efficiency. 2 young challengers had died learning that lesson. But each fight took something out of him. Each victory cost him more than it should have. Then came the night that broke something inside him. A coalition of 3 young males, each barely 6 years old and in their absolute prime, had coordinated a direct assault on Kiboro's pride. They were smart about it. They came at dusk when Kiboro was separated from the lionesses, hunting alone near the eastern plains. The 3 males hit him simultaneously, coming from 3 different directions like they had rehearsed it 100 times. Kiboro fought with everything he had left. His claws found flesh, his teeth found throats. But it was 3 against 1, and his 1 was no longer young. The battle lasted nearly 30 minutes. By the end, Kiboro was bleeding from wounds across his entire body. The young males retreated only because they recognized he was finally too hurt to continue, not because they had lost their nerve. They had scattered his pride the following morning. The lionesses they wanted to breed with, they kept. The others fled into neighboring territories. 2 cubs that had been born under Kiboro's protection didn't make it past the first day. The young males didn't need them. They only needed the breeding females. For 3 weeks after that, Kiboro disappeared. Every predator in the territory assumed he had finally died somewhere in the bush, ready to give his broken body to the hyenas and the vultures. The young males moved into his den. They marked every tree. They roared from every high point like they had never seen real leadership before. But Kiboro didn't die in the bush. He was out there in the deadlands beyond the territory, recovering in silence, letting his wounds heal, and something else was happening too. Something the young males couldn't have predicted. Something that happens sometimes in the wild, when a king falls and finds himself with absolutely nothing left except rage and memory. Kiboro was planning. For 3 weeks he watched the young males from a distance. He learned their routines. He studied how they hunted. He observed which one was truly the leader and which ones were just following along. He marked every weakness in their coordination. He identified the spots where they felt safest and the routes they used when moving through the territory. Most of all, he remembered. He remembered the nights when he had brought down buffalo single-handedly that these young males would never dare approach alone. He remembered the pride he had built from nothing, the lionesses who respected him, the territory he had carved out through strength and intelligence and ruthlessness. He remembered what it felt like to be feared, truly feared, by every living thing in 100 square kilometers. And he remembered his grandson, one of those cubs that the young males had killed without hesitation or remorse. As the 3rd week ended and Kiboro's wounds closed into permanent scars, something shifted behind his eyes. The other predators could sense it when he finally emerged from the deadlands and approached the territory boundary. A hyena clan that had been considering testing the old lion immediately changed direction and fled. A leopard that had been thinking about moving into abandoned territory retreated up into the trees. Even the wind seemed to pause when Kiboro released that first roar. It wasn't the roar of a desperate old male trying to reclaim what he had lost. It was deeper than that, more patient, more certain, the kind of roar that reminded every animal within its range that some lions don't fight because they want to win. They fight because something inside them refuses to accept defeat, refuses to fade, refuses to let the young males laugh at their graves. The 3 young males heard it, and something ancient stirred in their instincts. The largest one, a black-maned male named Scar from a wound across his face, was the first to understand what was coming. His confidence wavered for just a moment. But he was young, and youth always believes itself invincible. He organized his brothers. They would meet Kiboro at dawn near the main waterhole. They would finish what they had started 3 weeks ago. It would be their last mistake. Kiboro didn't come at dawn. He came at midnight when the world was dark and the young males had only positioned one lookout. That lookout never got a chance to call out a warning. Kiboro's teeth closed around his throat in the darkness, quick and efficient, the way a king kills when mercy has already left his heart. The other 2 young males woke to find their brother dead, and the old lion standing over the body, his scarred face barely visible in the moonlight, waiting. Scar charged first, the way aggressive young males always do when they encounter something that frightens them. Speed and strength and desperation, all of it aimed at the one opponent who had nothing to lose. Kiboro sidestepped with movement that should have been impossible for his joints, for his age, for his supposedly broken body. The young male crashed past and spun to charge again. By the time the sun rose over the African plains, the battle had been going for over an hour. Kiboro fought differently than he had in that first assault 3 weeks ago. He wasn't trying to overwhelm them through strength. He was using intelligence, using patience, making them come to him and punishing them for each mistake. Every wild charge was turned into a wound. Every overconfident strike was answered with a counter that cost blood. The second young male fell first, his leg shattered when Kiboro drove him into a rocky outcrop and twisted with all the leverage his massive body could provide. The male tried to stand and couldn't. Kiboro left him there, still alive but useless, and turned all his attention to Scar. The 2 fought as the morning light spread across the territory. Scar was strong. Scar was fast. Scar was in the absolute prime of his life. But Kiboro had something that 17 years of experience had given him. The understanding that victory wasn't about who was strongest in this moment. It was about who wanted it most and who was willing to pay the highest price to claim it. Scar was ready to retreat. Kiboro could see it in the way the young male's movements had slowed, the way his breathing had become ragged. The black-maned male was thinking about survival now, about running, about finding a new territory somewhere else, where an old lion couldn't chase him. That hesitation was everything. Kiboro pressed forward with movements that came from somewhere deeper than muscle, somewhere older than thought. He drove Scar back toward the cliff edge overlooking the river gorge. The young male tried to turn, tried to escape sideways, but the old lion had already anticipated every option. At the cliff edge, with nowhere left to run, Scar finally understood what had happened. He had challenged a king, and the king had responded not with desperation, but with certainty, with the absolute knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, even when the entire world says you're already dead. Scar fell from that cliff. Whether it was Kiboro's final push, or whether the young male jumped to avoid what he saw coming in those amber eyes, the story never made clear. But he fell, and the gorge was deep, and the river was waiting below. The third young male, watching from a distance, didn't wait to see what happened next. He ran. He limped away from the territory with what remained of his body, heading east toward the territories of other lions, carrying with him a story that would spread through every roar and every silent communication that predators use. The old lion that everyone had written off, the king that the young had mocked and challenged and tried to bury. He had not died quietly. He had not faded away. He had come back like a storm. Kiboro stood at the cliff edge in the early morning light, breathing hard, his body covered in fresh wounds that had opened his old scars. He was bleeding. He was exhausted. Every part of him screamed with pain, but his eyes held something that hadn't been there for months. Purpose, completion, the weight of a reckoning delivered. The pride's lionesses emerged from the territories where they had scattered during those 3 weeks of defeat. One by one they returned, following the sound of his roar, recognizing something in that call that told them their king was still alive, still powerful, still worth serving. They found him at his original den, the one the young males had taken over. He was resting in the shade of the rocks, his breathing still labored, his body still battered. But when the lead female approached cautiously, Kiboro lifted his head, and the look he gave her held all the reassurance she needed. The young lionesses brought their new cubs. The older females brought reports of kills made in the Deadlands, of survival through impossible circumstances. And slowly, without any dramatic declaration or announcement, Kiboro's pride reformed around him. But the territory was damaged. The prey had scattered. The boundaries had been marked and remarked so many times that the ecosystem itself seemed confused about who owned what. Kiboro realized in those first days after his victory that reclaiming the land wasn't the same as restoring it. He set about hunting the 3 young males' supporters. There were other young lions who had been inspired by the coalition's early successes, males who thought they might be able to take territory from an old king. Kiboro hunted them methodically. He didn't kill all of them. Some he wounded badly enough that they fled. Others he simply confronted, and they took one look at those amber eyes and decided their futures lay somewhere else. Within 2 months, every male who had supported the coalition had either fled the territory or learned what it meant to challenge a king who no longer had anything to lose. The hyena clans that had grown bold while Kiboro was weak received special attention. He hunted them, not for food, but for the message. A matriarch that had been responsible for the death of his grandson learned what it felt like to be hunted by something that wouldn't stop, wouldn't retreat, wouldn't accept mercy as an option. The other clans understood the message. They moved their territories north, away from the lion whose grief had become a weapon. By the time the wet season arrived, Kiboro's territory had been restored to something close to what it had been before the young males challenged him. The boundaries were secure, the prey had returned, the pride had grown, and new cubs were being born to the lionesses who recognized their king. But something had changed inside Kiboro himself. He was no longer the confident ruler who believed his strength was infinite. He had learned that lesson through pain and loss, and weeks spent in the Deadlands wondering if this was how it would end. He had learned that youth always thinks it will beat old age, and sometimes it does, and sometimes the old refuse to accept the logic of that equation. He had learned that survival sometimes means becoming something harder, something colder, something that remembers every wound and every loss, and never quite lets those memories heal. The other prides that bordered his territory gave him space. When their males came too close to the boundaries, Kiboro made sure they understood the cost of trespassing. When their lionesses wandered near his hunting grounds, he didn't attack them, but he let them see him watching, let them understand that this land belonged to someone who had already paid more for it than most lions could imagine. The young males who had fled carried the story with them as they moved into new territories. An old lion had come back from the Deadlands. He had destroyed the coalition that had broken him. He had hunted down every supporter they had. He had restored his pride and his territory, not through quick violence, but through a sustained assault that never stopped, never wavered, never accepted surrender. It became a cautionary tale told in roars and in the silent communications that predators use to warn each other. Don't challenge a king who has already lost everything. Don't break an old male who still has pride left. Don't push something into a corner unless you're prepared for it to come back as something more dangerous than it was before. Years passed. Kiboro aged further. His mane thinned even more. His teeth wore down to nubs. He could no longer hunt the largest prey, but he didn't need to. His reputation had become so legendary that younger males would leave his territory without being asked. The pride respected him in a way that was almost spiritual. His grandson's memory was honored in every cub born under his protection. The lionesses raised them knowing they belonged to a king who would protect them, who had already paid a terrible price to keep his family safe, who understood what it meant to face absolute darkness and choose to fight back. When Kiboro finally died, 8 years after that night of reckoning with the coalition, he died in his den surrounded by his pride. The lionesses mourned him in their way. The territory remembered him in the way predators remember legends, through stories passed in roars, through knowledge that certain boundaries were sacred because a king had died protecting them. His cubs inherited the territory. His grandsons established their own kingdoms in nearby lands. His bloodline spread through the savannah, carrying with it the genetic legacy of a male who had refused to become a cautionary tale about the inevitability of age and decline. Instead, he had become something else entirely, a story about resistance, about the moment when surrender seems inevitable, and something inside refuses to accept that conclusion, about what happens when a king falls and finds himself with nothing to lose, and discovers that nothing to lose is sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world. The other predators still talk about him sometimes, in the languages they use that humans can barely understand. An old lion who was mocked by the young, who was broken by a coalition that thought themselves invincible, who disappeared into the Deadlands and came back as something worse than death. They say that on certain nights when the wind blows across the African plains, you can still hear his roar echoing from the cliffs. a sound that reminds every living creature that the world belongs not to the young and strong, but to those who refuse to accept their endings. Kiboro's territory is still ruled by his descendants. The boundaries he fought for are still honored. The lionesses still tell their cubs the stories of the old king who came back from nothing to restore his kingdom. And somewhere in the night, when young males think about challenging an older male, they remember those stories. They remember what happens to confidence when it meets something that has already paid too much to accept defeat. They remember Kiboro, and they move on to challenge someone else. But the story of Kiboro doesn't end with his own reign. Every dynasty creates echoes that ripple forward through generations, and the king who had clawed his way back from oblivion had planted seeds that would grow into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. His legacy wasn't just about his own survival. It was about what his triumph taught every lion that came after him, every female that raised cubs under his protection, every young male that inherited his bloodline and his legend. His eldest son was named Mamba, a lion born from the pride's strongest female just months after Kiboro's great victory. The cub never knew the time when his father was weak. He never witnessed the weakness that had made the young males bold enough to challenge. Instead, Mamba grew up in a territory where his father's roar was law, where boundaries were absolute, where the very ground seemed to understand that it belonged to a king who had earned his throne through blood and will and refusal to accept the logic of decline. From the moment Mamba could walk, he understood something that most young males take years to learn. Power wasn't given, it was taken, it was held, it required constant vigilance and the willingness to bleed for it if necessary. Watching his father move through the territory with that particular intensity, that absolute certainty that came from having faced oblivion and refused to surrender to it, Mamba learned lessons that his brothers never quite grasped. His younger brothers were strong. They inherited Kiboro's physical traits. But Mamba inherited something deeper. He inherited the understanding that survival sometimes meant being willing to become something harder than your enemies expected, something colder, something that had learned that mercy was a luxury only the young could afford. When Kiboro finally stepped back from active territory defense at 14 years old, ancient by lion standards, it was Mamba who stepped into his place, not through sudden violence or dramatic confrontation, but through the gradual understanding that the old king had passed the crown to a successor who understood its weight. Mamba's rule was different from his father's, where Kiboro had been reactive, sometimes brutal in his enforcement of boundaries. Mamba was calculating. He expanded the territory, not through constant warfare, but through strategic alliance and the careful elimination of weaker neighbors. He bred with every lioness that would have him, not out of arrogance, but out of a deliberate decision to spread his genetic legacy as widely as possible. He understood something that Kiboro had learned too late in life. A kingdom is only as strong as the generation that will inherit it. Under Mamba's rule, the territory doubled in size within 5 years. The pride flourished. Cubs survived at rates that were nearly unprecedented. The ecosystem itself seemed to respond to leadership that combined Kiboro's intensity with Mamba's strategic patience. But Mamba's greatest achievement wasn't territorial expansion or breeding success. It was what he did with the story of his father. He made sure every young male that he encountered knew exactly what Kiboro had accomplished. He would take his own sons to the cliff edge where Scar had fallen, and he would tell them the story, not as a boast, but as a lesson. Here is where the old king proved that age doesn't mean helplessness. Here is where a male who everyone had written off reclaimed his kingdom. Here is where pride became a weapon more powerful than youth. The story spread through the savannah, the way predators spread information, through roars that carried for miles, through visual markers that other lions understood, through the silent language of scent and presence, and the way a territory felt when it was ruled by lions who had something to teach. Young males from other territories began asking to join Mamba's coalition. They wanted to learn from a lion who was the son of a legend. They wanted to understand how to rule the way that Mamba ruled, with strength tempered by intelligence and the absolute certainty that came from inherited knowledge. Mamba accepted some of them. He sent others away. He was careful about who he allowed into his inner circle, understanding that power shared with the wrong allies was power that would eventually turn against you. 15 years into Mamba's reign, when he was already showing the first signs of age that would eventually claim all lions, something remarkable happened. His own sons began to establish their own territories nearby, and instead of viewing them as competitors, Mamba supported them. He helped them defend their new boundaries. He introduced them to lionesses from neighboring territories. He ensured that when his time came to step back, the dynasty he had inherited from his father would continue forward even stronger than before. It was a lesson that Kiboro had never had the opportunity to teach while he was alive. But Mamba had learned it through watching his father, through understanding that a true legacy isn't built on a single male's dominance. It's built on creating successors who understand what you've sacrificed to achieve. By the time Mamba died, the territory that Kiboro had reclaimed and Mamba had expanded had become something more than just land. It had become a kingdom, a place where the bloodline of the old lion who had refused to accept his ending had spread so thoroughly that nearly every pride for 100 square kilometers carried his genetics. His cubs inherited not just his genes but his story, and his grandsons inherited both the territory and the understanding of what it meant to rule it. The third generation of Kiboro's legacy came in the form of a coalition of 5 males born in a single season to different mothers. They were the grandsons of the king who had come back from the Deadlands, the sons of Mamba the strategist, and they inherited something that was becoming rarer in the African wilderness. They inherited certainty. These 5 males never doubted their right to rule. They never questioned their ability to hold territory against challenges. They never wondered if they were strong enough or smart enough or willing enough. They had been raised on stories of their grandfather's comeback. They had been trained by a father who understood that power was a responsibility, not a privilege. They moved through the territory like they owned it, because in their bones they understood that they did. They had paid the price for it through their ancestors' blood. They had inherited the burden of protecting it through every fiber of their being. When other coalitions tested their boundaries, these 5 males responded with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural. They fought not as individuals trying to prove their worth, but as a single organism that had been trained through generations to move as one unit. They hunted with an efficiency that left other prides scrambling for food in their own territories. But more than anything, they ruled with the knowledge that came from inheritance. They understood that a territory well held is a territory that becomes stronger over time. They understood that the lionesses respected them not because they were young and powerful, but because they represented stability, continuity, a link to something larger than themselves. The story of Kiboro had become mythology by then. The old lion was a legend that mothers told to their cubs. The cliff where Scar had fallen was a sacred place where young males went to contemplate what it meant to challenge something that refused to break. But the real impact of Kiboro's legacy wasn't in the mythology. It was in the genetics and the understanding that had been passed down through every generation. The knowledge that survival sometimes means refusing to accept the ending that everyone else has planned for you. One of the 5 grandsons, a male named Chimba, became particularly interested in preserving the family history. He would take cubs to the old den where Kiboro had spent his final years. He would show them the rocks where their ancestor had rested after his great battle. He would tell them, in the ways that lions communicate, the story of the old king who had come back. It became a ritual, passed down through the generations. Every young male in that bloodline learned the story. Every female that bred with those males learned to understand what she was contributing to when she chose to have cubs with the descendants of the lion who had refused to die quietly. The territory itself changed over the decades. Prey populations shifted. Water sources dried up or became abundant. Other prides moved in and out of neighboring lands. But Kiboro's kingdom remained, held by his descendants, protected by the legacy of a male who had already paid such a terrible price that no challenge seemed too great to face. 20 years after Kiboro's original battle with the coalition, the landscape had changed completely, but the pride that descended from his line was stronger than ever. His genetic legacy had spread so thoroughly that nearly every lion in the region carried some portion of his DNA. The other predators recognized this. Hyenas stayed away from the territory because they remembered what had happened when Kiboro's rage had been directed at them. Leopards avoided hunting near the pride's territories because they understood that these lions fought differently, more intelligently, with the absolute knowledge that came from inherited certainty. Young males from other territories would sometimes try to move into Kiboro's land, thinking they might establish themselves there. They would either be driven out quickly or, in some cases, allowed to stay if they were strong enough and willing enough to submit to the pride's hierarchy. The territory became something of a training ground for young males who wanted to learn what it meant to rule properly. They would arrive, fight the current defending males, and if they won, they would stay and learn from lions who had been trained by descendants of the greatest fighter any of them had ever heard about. It was a meritocracy built on a foundation of legendary resistance. 50 years after Kiboro's original comeback, the original king was long dead, but his story had become so deeply embedded in the territory that it was practically written into the soil itself. Young lions born there inherited not just the genetic capability to survive and thrive, but the cultural knowledge that resistance was possible, that age didn't guarantee irrelevance, that a male could fall and come back stronger than before. The lionesses that bred in that territory understood that they were contributing to a legacy. They didn't think about it in those terms, but on some instinctual level, they knew that their cubs would carry forward the story of the old king. Their offspring would inherit not just physical strength, but the understanding that true power came from refusing to accept the fate that seemed inevitable. Researchers who studied the pride over the decades documented something unusual. The lions in Kiboro's territory had higher survival rates than comparable prides in other regions. Cubs survived at rates that should have been impossible. Males held territory longer than typical. Lionesses bred more successfully. At first, the researchers attributed this to geographic advantage or prey availability, but as they studied more carefully, they began to understand something that was harder to quantify but more fundamentally true. These lions fought differently. They fought with the certainty that came from inherited knowledge. They fought with the understanding that survival meant more than just physical dominance in the moment. It meant the willingness to bleed for something that mattered, the ability to get back up after you had been knocked down, the refusal to accept that the world had already decided your fate. It was as if the legacy of Kiboro had somehow been encoded into the very behavior of his descendants. The researchers couldn't prove it scientifically. You can't measure legacy in a test tube. You can't photograph the way that inherited stories change how a lion moves through the world. But over years of observation, they documented something that they struggled to explain. Kiboro's bloodline was stronger in ways that had nothing to do with muscle mass or claw sharpness or any of the traditional markers of physical dominance. They were stronger because they believed in their own survival. That belief had been passed down from a father to his son, from Mamba to his sons, from the grandsons to their cubs, through generation after generation, and it had become something almost spiritual, a knowledge that ran deeper than instinct, that was woven into the fabric of who these lions were. When challenges came, and challenges always come in the African wilderness, the descendants of Kiboro faced them with a particular kind of certainty, not arrogance, not the confidence of youth that assumes invincibility, but something deeper and more grounded, the certainty that came from knowing that their bloodline had already proven itself capable of surviving the unsurvivable. The territory remained Kiboro's kingdom, in name and in spirit, long after the original king's bones had turned to dust, and every lion born there, whether they were direct descendants or newcomers who had joined the pride, learned the story. They learned about the old king who had been mocked by the young, who had been beaten down and broken and left for dead, who had disappeared into the deadlands and come back as something harder, something colder, something that would not accept the logic of inevitable decline. They learned that his victory hadn't just been about reclaiming his territory, it had been about proving something fundamental about the nature of survival itself, that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from never falling, but from getting back up after you have been shattered. That age and experience and the willingness to bleed for something that matters can overcome the simple advantage of youth and speed and inexperience. Most of all, they learned that a king who refuses to die quietly teaches that lesson to everyone who comes after him. But every legend eventually faces a test that threatens to unravel everything that came before, and Kiboro's legacy, as powerful as it had become, was about to face its greatest challenge, not from within the pride, but from something far more unexpected, something that would force every descendant of the old king to prove that the lessons learned from his comeback were more than just stories told around waterholes. 75 years after Kiboro's original battle at the cliff edge, the territory had become something almost mythical. Lions from across the savannah knew the stories. Young males traveled for days just to fight the pride that descended from the king who had refused to die. It was considered the greatest honor to be accepted into Kiboro's kingdom, the ultimate validation that you were strong enough, smart enough, willing enough to carry forward the legacy. But the pride had grown complacent in its success. Territory that had been held through constant vigilance and aggressive boundary defense was now held through reputation alone. The descendants of Kiboro were so legendary that few dared to challenge them. Younger males accepted the boundaries without fighting. Neighboring prides respected the borders without questioning them. The ecosystem had settled into a pattern where Kiboro's kingdom was simply understood to be inviolable. It made the pride lazy. The hunting became less precise. The patrols became less frequent. The constant awareness that had characterized Kiboro's leadership and Mamba's strategic approach had faded into something more relaxed, more confident, more dangerous in its assumption that the world would simply accept their dominance forever. They had forgotten the most important lesson that the old king had taught, that empires built on reputation alone are empires waiting to collapse. The threat came from the east, from territories so far away that the pride had never even considered them a potential rival. A coalition of 6 young males, bred and trained in the harshest part of the savannah, had decided that they were going to carve out a kingdom for themselves. They had heard the stories about Kiboro's territory. They had understood that it was rich, that it was well protected by prides that believed themselves superior, and they had decided that the only way to prove themselves as true leaders was to take that kingdom from the lions who thought they owned it. The first assault came without warning, the way the best attacks always do. The young males came at dawn, moving with coordination that suggested they had trained for this specific challenge. They attacked the pride's hunting parties while the males were separated. They killed lionesses and cubs. They marked the territory with their own scent, making a statement that was impossible to ignore. This land now belonged to them, or it would belong to them by the time they were finished. The response from Kiboro's descendants was immediate and brutal. The defending males converged on the invaders, and a battle erupted that lasted through the entire morning. Young male bodies fell on both sides. Blood stained the grass in dark patches. The savannah itself seemed to hold its breath as the two forces clashed with an intensity that hadn't been seen in this territory for decades. But something was wrong. The defending males fought well, but they fought like a pride that had forgotten what it meant to truly be tested. Their coordination was good, but not perfect. Their ferocity was genuine, but it lacked the edge that came from fighting for survival, rather than simply defending what you had already assumed would always be yours. By midday, when the invading coalition finally retreated, they did so with their heads high. They had been beaten, yes, but they had bloodied the legendary pride. They had proven that Kiboro's descendants could bleed, could be hurt, could be made to question their dominance. That knowledge spread through the invaders' minds like wildfire. They would return, and next time, they would be better prepared. The pride called an emergency gathering that evening. The senior males, the descendants of Mamba, the great-grandsons of Kiboro, assembled to discuss what had happened. The acknowledgement came slowly, but it came. They had grown soft. They had believed their own mythology. They had forgotten that legends are only maintained through constant effort, through the willingness to bleed to protect them. They had forgotten Kiboro. That night, the pride did something that had not been done in generations. They went to the cliff edge where Scar had fallen all those decades ago. The oldest males gathered the younger ones, and in the way that lions communicate, through roars and positioning, and the subtle language of presence, they retold the story of the old king. Not as a legend to be celebrated from a distance, but as a lesson to be learned and applied immediately. Not as something that had happened in the past, but as something that was happening right now, in this very moment, as they faced a challenge that threatened to destroy everything their ancestor had built. A great-grandson of Kiboro, a male named Rafiki, who carried the old king's bloodline most purely, took position at the highest point of the cliff. His mane caught the moonlight, his scarred face was visible to every lion gathered below, and he roared, a sound that carried all the way to the boundaries of the territory and beyond. It was a declaration, it was a promise, it was a statement that the legacy of Kiboro was not dead, not faded, not lost to time and complacency. The reckoning was about to begin. The invading coalition returned 3 days later, moving with even greater coordination than before. This time, they brought reinforcements. 2 additional males joined their group, young warriors from neighboring territories who had been promised a share of the kingdom if the assault succeeded. 8 young males against a pride that had grown complacent. The math seemed to favor the attackers, but the pride had remembered. They had trained continuously for 3 days. They had reorganized their hunting strategies. They had re-established their patrols and their boundaries. Most importantly, they had reconnected with something that had been dormant in their bloodline for far too long. The understanding that survival means being willing to bleed for what matters. The second battle was different from the first. The defending males fought with a coordination that seemed to come from some deeper place, as if the very ground they were defending was whispering strategy to them. They fought with the knowledge that came from inherited understanding, the certainty that came from knowing that their ancestor had already proven that no challenge was too great, if you were willing to pay the price for victory. Rafiki fought at the center of the battle, his scarred face twisted with intensity, his movements carrying the memory of Kiboro himself. The invading leader, a massive male named Torbo, with a mane as dark as midnight, locked eyes with Rafiki across the chaos of combat. And in that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, the knowledge that one of them was about to learn what it meant to challenge the descendants of a king who had refused to die. The fight between Rafiki and Torbo lasted nearly 40 minutes. The rest of the battle raged around them, but it was their confrontation that would determine everything. Torbo was larger, he was stronger in the way that youth always is, but Rafiki fought with something that transcended physical dominance. He fought with the knowledge of his bloodline. Every feint, every counter, every calculated retreat was informed by generations of lions who had learned what it meant to survive the unsurvivable. Rafiki moved as if Kiboro himself was directing his paws, as if the old king's spirit was guiding every decision. By the time the sun began to set, Torbo was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and more importantly, he was broken. Not in his body, though that was battered enough, but in his spirit. He had come to this territory believing that his youth and strength would be enough to overcome any opposition. He was learning, too late, that age and experience and the will to survive can overcome speed and power and overconfidence. Rafiki delivered the final blow with a grace that bordered on mercy, and as Torbo fell, the other invaders broke and ran. They had lost their leader, they had lost the certainty that had driven them forward, and they had learned in the harshest way possible that some territories are defended by more than just muscle and teeth. They are defended by legacy. The pride stood victorious, but every lion present understood that something fundamental had changed. The test had proven that the bloodline of Kiboro was strong, yes, but more than that, it had proven that the legacy itself was strong. The stories, the lessons, the inherited understanding of what it meant to survive against impossible odds, these things were real. They were tangible. They could be passed down again, and they would remain as powerful as the day they were first earned in blood at a cliff edge 75 years ago. Rafiki limped through the territory in the aftermath, accepting the respect of every lion he encountered. The lionesses approached him with deference. The younger males bowed their heads in recognition of his leadership, but Rafiki felt something that victory should not have brought him. Exhaustion. The weight of the legacy was real. It was powerful, but it was also a burden that required constant renewal, constant proof, constant willingness to bleed and fight and sacrifice. The pride had learned this lesson once, centuries ago, when Kiboro had faced it. They were learning it again now, in their own generation, and Rafiki understood that every generation would have to learn this lesson for themselves. It could not simply be inherited. It had to be earned, through blood, through struggle, through the willingness to face challenges that seemed insurmountable and overcome them anyway. The territory was restored. The boundaries were reinforced. The patrols resumed their vigilance, but something had shifted in the pride's understanding. They had been reminded that legends are not automatic. They are maintained only through constant effort, through the refusal to become complacent, through the willingness to face any challenge and overcome it. In the weeks following the battle, Rafiki made a decision. He would ensure that the legacy of Kiboro was not just a story told by old lions to young cubs. He would ensure that every male in the pride understood the depths of what their ancestor had accomplished. And more than that, he would ensure that they understood that accomplishment was not something to rest upon. It was something to build upon. He established new training practices. Young males were taken to the cliff edge, not just to hear the story, but to understand what it meant to face something that seemed impossible and refuse to surrender. They were taught to fight not just with strength, but with intelligence, with patience, with the understanding that true power came from being willing to bleed for something that mattered. The pride changed under Rafiki's leadership. They became something different from what they had been before. They became something closer to what Kiboro had been, and even closer to what Mamba had built. They became a pride that understood that every generation had to prove itself worthy of the legacy it had inherited. Years passed. Rafiki aged. His mane began to thin. His movements slowed, but his grip on the territory remained absolute. He had transformed the pride from something that was resting on its reputation into something that was actively, constantly earning that reputation through every patrol, every hunt, every moment of vigilance. When Rafiki finally stepped back from active leadership, at an age when most lions were already dead, he had ensured that the next generation understood what he had learned, that the legacy of Kiboro was not a gift to be received and held passively. It was a burden to be carried actively, a responsibility to be renewed in each generation, a promise to be kept through blood and sacrifice, and the refusal to accept that any challenge was insurmountable. His successor, a male named Jabari, who carried Kiboro's bloodline as purely as Rafiki did, took over the territory with the understanding that the real work was just beginning. The territory would not maintain itself, the legend would not sustain itself. Every single day required effort, vigilance, the willingness to bleed if necessary to keep the kingdom intact. Jabari looked at the cliff edge where Scar had fallen, where the story of the old king's comeback had been written in blood and victory, and he understood something that perhaps even Kiboro himself had not fully grasped in those final moments of his original battle. The real triumph was not in winning a single fight. The real triumph was in building something that would survive long after the original victor was dead, something that would inspire and teach and guide generations of lions that would never know the male who had first earned it. The real triumph was in creating a legacy so powerful that it would reshape not just how a pride fought, but how they thought, how they understood themselves, what they believed was possible. That was the triumph that Kiboro had accidentally created when he refused to die quietly at the cliff edge. He had not just reclaimed his territory, he had created something immortal, and now it was up to Jabari and every successor that would come after him to ensure that immortality was maintained, renewed, strengthened with each passing generation. The pride was ready, the territory was secure, the legend lived on. The final chapter of Kiboro's legacy extends far beyond his lifetime. 100 years after his original comeback, the territory remained one of the most legendary kingdoms in the entire region. Every lion born there inherited something intangible but undeniably powerful. They inherited the understanding that survival was possible even when everything seemed impossible. Young males would journey from territories far away just to visit the cliff edge where Scar had fallen, seeking to understand what had happened there, hoping the ground itself might teach them something about courage and resistance. Researchers who studied the pride documented something remarkable. The lions exhibited levels of cooperation and strategic thinking that were unusual for wild lions. They hunted with precision that suggested cultural knowledge passed down through generations. It was as if the pride was following a blueprint written in blood decades ago and never quite forgotten. Dr. Sarah Chen, a researcher who spent 15 years studying the pride, became convinced she was witnessing something unprecedented. Not just biological inheritance of genetic traits, but cultural inheritance of behavioral patterns and strategic understanding. She documented how older females would teach younger ones hunting techniques more complex than typical lion approaches. She recorded instances where defending males would deliberately lead invading coalitions to particular battlegrounds, suggesting they were choosing terrain based on inherited knowledge. Most remarkably, she documented multiple instances where young males would retreat from confrontations, not because they were losing, but because they seemed to recognize a pattern their ancestors had learned was dangerous. It was as if the memory of past battles was somehow encoded into the behavior of lions who had never experienced those battles themselves. She published her findings, and slowly the idea took hold that what she was documenting was real, that predators were capable of passing down more than just genes. They were capable of passing down knowledge, strategy, understanding, the collective memory of a bloodline. By the time Dr. Chen finished her research, Kiboro had been dead for over a century. Yet a lion named Simba, who claimed direct descent from the old king, moved through the world with certainty that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than instinct. When Simba faced a challenge to his territory, he responded with tactics remarkably similar to those Kiboro had employed. He used terrain in ways that suggested inherited knowledge. He fought with patience and calculation rather than pure aggression. The most powerful moment in Dr. Chen's research came when she witnessed Simba confront an invading coalition. The younger males were stronger, faster, more aggressive. By every measure of raw physical capability, they should have overwhelmed the older lion. But Simba fought with something that transcended physicality. He fought with memory. He seemed to anticipate every move before the younger males made it. He positioned himself on terrain that gave him advantage before the battle was fully engaged. Within 30 minutes, the invading coalition was retreating, their leader wounded and broken, their confidence shattered by a lion who had fought as if he knew exactly what was coming. Simba died 3 years later. At the advanced age of 17, Dr. Chen documented the behavior of younger males as they gathered at the cliff edge. They roared in unison, a sound that was part mourning, part celebration, part declaration that the legacy would continue. When Dr. Chen published her final research, she titled it The Immortal King, Cultural Transmission of Behavioral Knowledge in an African Lion Pride. The paper was groundbreaking. It suggested that animals, particularly social animals like lions, were capable of preserving and transmitting non-genetic information across generations. 300 years after Kiboro's original battle at the cliff edge, the territory remained, though the specific pride composition had changed dozens of times, but the behaviors, the strategies, the understanding of what it meant to survive, remained. Even lions with no genetic connection to Kiboro seemed to absorb the understanding that came from living in a territory shaped by his example. Environmental scientists studying the region noted something unusual. This particular territory had shown remarkable stability across centuries, while other nearby territories had experienced dramatic fluctuations. The lions seemed to manage the ecosystem more effectively than typical predators, hunting sustainably, maintaining boundaries that allowed prey to recover. It was as if the territory was being ruled not just by the current generation, but by something older, something more fundamental, as if the accumulated wisdom of generations was guiding each new ruler toward decisions that would preserve the kingdom. In the modern era, centuries after Kiboro's death, tourists still hear the stories. Local guides still point to the cliff edge and tell the tale of the old lion who came back. The legend has become so embedded in the culture that many believe it to be pure mythology. But the lions know better. Every descendant that inherits territory from an older male carrying Kiboro's legacy seems to understand on some level that they are inheriting more than just land. They are inheriting a responsibility, a knowledge, a way of being in the world that has been shaped by one male's refusal to surrender. When challenges come, the lions that rule Kiboro's territory face them with certainty that can only come from generations of successful survival. They fight with strategies that seem to come from somewhere deeper than individual experience. They understand terrain and positioning, and the mathematics of combat in ways that should not be possible, but they have been taught. They have been taught by the ground they walk on, by the memories encoded in the territory itself, by the accumulated wisdom of a bloodline that stretches back to a single moment when one lion refused to accept the logic of his own ending. The researchers who continue to study the pride try to explain it in scientific terms, but everyone who has spent significant time in the territory knows there is something more, something almost spiritual about the way Kiboro's legacy persists. It is as if the old king, in his refusal to die quietly, imprinted something fundamental on the very fabric of his territory, an understanding that survival is always possible, that age does not mean helplessness, that falling does not mean staying fallen, that the world does not have the right to dictate your ending. These lessons persist in the confidence with which young males defend their boundaries. They persist in the way older lions teach younger ones how to hunt and fight and think. They persist in the choice that every new generation makes to maintain and strengthen the territory. Kiboro's reign lasted only 17 years. His direct genetic influence lasted perhaps a century, but his real legacy continues indefinitely. It continues in every lion born in his territory. It continues in every battle fought with tactics that seem to come from inherited understanding. It continues in the ecosystem shaped by generations of sustainable management. It continues in the understanding that some kings refuse to stay dead. On certain nights, when the wind blows across the African plains and carries the roars of lions across the savannah, you can hear something in those sounds that transcends the simple mechanics of territorial declaration. You can hear memory. You can hear the accumulated voice of generations. You can hear the echo of a single lion's refusal to accept an ending that everyone else had planned for him. The cliff edge where Scar fell remains. The territory where Kiboro reclaimed his throne remains. The pride that descended from his line remains, changed and evolved and transformed, but fundamentally recognizable in its commitment to survival, in its refusal to accept limits, in its understanding that true strength comes not from never falling, but from getting back up after you have been shattered. Every young male that arrives in that territory learns the story, not as a mythology, but as a blueprint, not as something that happened in the past, but as something that is happening right now, as each new generation chooses to carry forward the legacy instead of simply resting upon it. The old lion who was mocked by the young, who was broken by a coalition that thought themselves invincible, who disappeared into the deadlands and came back as something harder, something colder. He became eternal, and that was the greatest triumph of all.